Today's number 5 most urgent vulnerability on the Daily Ranked CVE Brief is CVE 2026-20230 in Cisco Unified Communications Manager. And this is exactly the kind of issue our ranking is built to surface. Not just a high score on paper, but real exploitation signal with CISA KEV status, a very high EPSS percentile, and a vendor warning that the practical impact is more severe than the base CVSS label suggests. The short version: an unauthenticated remote attacker may be able to abuse an affected Unified CM or Unified CM SME device through server-side request forgery, and a successful exploit could write files to the underlying operating system that may later be used to elevate to root. One important constraint: Cisco notes the web dialer service must be enabled, and web dialer is disabled by default, so this is not a reason to panic, but it is a reason to check fast. Cisco Unified Communications Manager, often shortened to Unified CM, is part of the infrastructure many organizations use to manage enterprise communications. The affected products named here are Cisco Unified CM and Cisco Unified Communications Manager Session Management Edition, or Unified CM SME. The weakness is CWE-918, server-side request forgery, usually called SSRF. In plain English, SSRF means an attacker can influence a server into making a request it should not make, using the server's own network position and trust boundaries. According to the NVD description, this vulnerability exists because of improper input validation for specific HTTP requests. An attacker can send a crafted HTTP request to an affected device. If successful, the result could be file writes to the underlying operating system, and those files could later be used to elevate privileges to root. That root escalation possibility is why Cisco assigned a critical security impact rating, even though the CVSS base score is high. Verdict: CVSS 8.6 high, but treat this as operationally critical where web dialer is enabled on an affected system. The two score elements that matter most are reachability and authentication. The vector shows network attack vector, low attack complexity, no privileges required, and no user interaction. That means the attacker does not need an account on the target, and the attack does not depend on tricking a user into clicking something. For defenders, that combination is what moves an issue from schedule it to verify exposure now. The other important part is integrity impact. The CVSS vector has high integrity impact, consistent with the described ability to write files. CVSS does not always capture every operational consequence, and Cisco explicitly notes that exploitation could result in later elevation to root. That is why the vendor's security impact rating is critical, even though the numerical score lands at 8.6 high. The reason this CVE is on today's ranked list is not just the score. It is also on CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. KEV status means defenders should assume this is relevant to real-world risk, not just lab analysis. Add the EPSS percentile of 0.98511. And the probability signal is also very high relative to other vulnerabilities. That does not tell you who is exploiting it, how they are doing it, or whether your specific environment has been touched. We do not have those details here, and we should not invent them. But it does tell us the defensive posture. Identify affected Unified CM or Unified CM SME systems, determine whether web dialer is enabled, and put remediation ahead of routine maintenance. Communications infrastructure is often highly trusted internally. If a flaw in that layer can lead to operating system file writes, the blast radius can become serious quickly. Conceptually, the attack path starts with network access to the affected device's HTTP-facing functionality and depends on web dialer being enabled. Cisco states web dialer is disabled by default, so that service state is a major exposure divider. With SSRF, the attacker is not simply making the target return a web page. The dangerous idea is that attacker-controlled input influences what the server does on the back end. Because the request originates from the server, it may reach places or perform actions that would not be available directly from the attacker's machine. In this case, the described consequence is the ability to write files to the underlying operating system, which could be used later for root escalation. Defensively, the key takeaway is not the exact crafted request. It is the trust boundary failure. An externally reachable or broadly reachable communications server may be tricked into performing server-side actions it should never perform. Start with inventory. Look for Cisco Unified Communications Manager and Unified CM SME systems in production, disaster recovery, lab, and staging environments. Do not assume voice infrastructure is fully captured in standard server inventories. Communications platforms often live in their own operational lane. Next, confirm whether web dialer is enabled. The NVD description specifically says web dialer must be enabled to exploit this vulnerability, and that web dialer is disabled by default. That makes service validation one of the fastest ways to separate urgent exposure from lower risk inventory. For exact affected versions and fixed releases, use the Cisco Security Advisory directly. We are not going to guess version ranges here. Also review where the relevant HTTP interfaces are reachable from. If management or application interfaces are exposed to untrusted networks, broad internal networks, or segments that do not need access, treat that as unnecessary attack surface. The first remediation step is to follow Cisco's advisory for affected software and the appropriate fixed release or mitigation guidance. If the system is affected, patching should be prioritized. Where web dialer is not required, disable it and verify that it remains disabled after maintenance. Because Cisco says exploitation requires web dialer to be enabled, removing that service exposure is a meaningful risk reduction, but it should not replace applying the vendor fix where a system is affected. Next, restrict reachability. Only systems and users with a legitimate business need should be able to access the relevant unified CM web functions. Use segmentation, access controls, and firewall rules to reduce who can talk to these services. Finally, validate. Confirm the service state, confirm the software remediation, and confirm that business calling workflows still function. Document the result, because KEV-listed vulnerabilities often require clear evidence that the exposure was addressed. For monitoring, start with the assumption that normal unified CM and web dialer behavior should be predictable. Watch HTTP logs for unusual request patterns against unified CM systems, especially activity involving web dialer where usage is normally limited or absent. Look for spikes and errors, unexpected methods, or request shapes, repeated probing, or requests coming from networks that should not interact with these services. Because this is SSRF, also watch for unusual outbound connections from unified CM systems. A communications manager should not suddenly make unexpected requests to destinations outside its normal operational pattern. Establish what normal looks like in your environment, then alert on deviations. On the host side, the described successful impact includes writing files to the underlying operating system, so monitor for unexpected file creation or modification where your platform controls allow it. Detection should not wait for a perfect signature. Combine service logs, network egress monitoring, and change monitoring. To recap, CVE 2026-20230 is today's number 5 on our ranked list. It affects Cisco Unified CM and Unified CM SME. It is a CWE 918 server-side request forgery issue, and it can allow an unauthenticated remote attacker to trigger behavior that may write files to the underlying operating system and later support root escalation. The big exposure question is whether web dialer is enabled, because Cisco notes it is required for exploitation and is disabled by default. But because this CVE is in CISA KEV and sits in a very high EPSS percentile, exposed affected systems deserve immediate attention. If you run Unified CM, check the Cisco advisory, verify versions, verify web dialer state, patch, harden access, and monitor. This is the Daily Ranked CVE Brief, what to patch first, ranked by real exploitation signal from CISA KEV, first EPSS, and CVSS, every day. Subscribe for the next ranked breakdown and see the full ranked report linked in the description.